An elderly couple left for a cruise, but 6 years later, their grandson explores an abandoned island and makes an unbelievable discovery. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The steady rhythm of waves against the hull seemed to mirror the beating of Matthew Thompson's heart as he stood alone at the bow of the research vessel. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, the result of too many sleepless nights spent poring over charts and sonar readings. The salt-laden wind tousled his unkempt hair as his fingers traced the outline of an old photograph, his grandparents smiling brightly before boarding what would be their final cruise 6 years ago. "We're almost at the coordinates," he whispered to the photograph, as if Harold and Elaine Thompson could somehow hear him through the worn paper. "I'm going to find you this time." Matthew's mind drifted back to their last conversation, the words still cutting him like glass 6 years later. He'd been frustrated about their predictable retirement plans, another cruise to celebrate their anniversary. "Why don't you ever do anything unexpected?" He'd challenged his grandfather, who had spent 40 years as a high school math teacher. "You've lived your entire lives in the same house, taking the same vacations, following the same routines. Don't you want one real adventure before it's too late?" His grandmother had looked hurt, but his grandfather merely smiled. "Not everyone needs to climb mountains or discover new species to have lived a good life, Matty." "Yeah, but you've had such predictable, boring lives," Matthew had replied with the careless cruelty of youth. "I mean, what stories will you even leave behind?" The memory dissolved as a wave crashed against the ship, sending a spray of seawater across his face. Now, those words were the albatross around his neck, the reason he had redirected his promising career in oceanography, into this obsession with finding answers in a vast, uncaring ocean. Back in his cramped office below deck, Matthew spread out his latest charts on the small desk. The walls were covered with maps marked with red circles and X's, each representing an area he had already searched during previous expeditions. Photos of his grandparents were pinned alongside the maps. Harold in his signature blue Hawaiian shirt, grinning broadly. Elaine in her favorite yellow floral dress, always wearing the pearl necklace Matthew had given her for her 70th birthday. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Sophia Chen stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her expression a mixture of professional concern and personal frustration. "The team is waiting for the updated research parameters," she said, her tone carefully controlled. "We've already spent 3 days analyzing currents in this quadrant, and we're supposed to move on to the algae bloom site tomorrow." Matthew straightened up, avoiding her eyes. "I need just one more day here. The satellite data shows unusual current patterns that could explain how a ship might have been carried off course." "That's not what this expedition is funded for, and you know it," Sophia replied, stepping fully into the room. Her eyes softened momentarily as they passed over the photographs. "Matt, it's been 6 years. The official investigation concluded it was a mechanical failure followed by a sudden storm. Sometimes we have to accept that the ocean keeps its secrets." "Not this time," Matthew said, pointing to his calculations. "Look at these readings. There's something here. An unmapped current that could have carried a disabled vessel precisely toward—" "Toward what?" Sophia interrupted. "We've already diverted university resources for your personal search multiple times. The board is asking questions, and I'm running out of excuses." The mention of the university board made Matthew tense. "Tell them we're expanding the current mapping project. It's still valuable research, just in a different area than originally planned." "That's not honest, and it's not fair to the other scientists whose projects were declined so ours could be funded," Sophia countered, her voice lowered. "It's not fair to me either, Matt. I believed in this research when we applied together, before it became this." Matthew knew what she meant by this, his obsession, the same one that had eventually driven them apart romantically 8 months ago, though they still maintained a professional relationship. He had canceled too many dates to check new sonar data, missed her birthday to meet with a retired Coast Guard captain who claimed to have seen something unusual in these waters years ago. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't think there was something here," he said quietly. Before Sophia could respond, the door burst open again. Dr. Reeves, the senior marine biologist, stood there with an unmistakable look of anger on his weathered face. "Thompson, I've just checked the monitoring equipment. You've recalibrated the deep-sea sonar arrays to detect metal signatures instead of biological masses," he accused. "That's expensive equipment meant for tracking marine mammal migrations, not your personal scavenger hunt." Matthew stepped forward defensively. "I'll reset them before we reach the algae bloom site. The calibration changes aren't permanent." "That's not the point," Dr. Reeves shouted. "You're compromising our primary mission for your—" "For my what?" Matthew challenged, his voice rising to match Reeves. "For trying to find out what happened to two people who vanished without a trace. The official investigation was a joke. 3 days of searching, and they declared it hopeless." Sophia stepped between them. "This isn't helping. Dr. Reeves, I'll personally ensure the equipment is recalibrated correctly by morning. Matthew, we need to talk privately." After Reeves left, slamming the door behind him, Matthew collapsed into his chair. Sophia sat across from him, her expression softer now that they were alone. "The university's scheduled a video call for tomorrow morning," she said. "They want a progress report on the official research objectives." Matthew nodded, already formulating half-truths he could tell about their work. It wouldn't be the first time. "I'll handle it." Later that night, long after most of the crew had gone to sleep, Matthew sat alone in the monitoring room. The gentle hum of equipment provided a soothing background as he watched the sonar readings, searching for anything unusual in the ocean depths below. The ship creaked around him, a reminder of how small they were against the vastness of the Pacific. The door opened behind him, and Sophia entered with 2 cups of coffee. She placed one beside him without a word, and took the seat at the adjacent monitoring station. "You don't have to keep me company," Matthew said, though he was grateful for her presence. "I couldn't sleep anyway," she replied. After a moment of silence, she added, "We were good together, you know, before all this." Matthew nodded, his eyes still fixed on the screen. "I know. I'm sorry I couldn't be what you needed." "It wasn't about what I needed," Sophia said quietly. "It was about you being so focused on what you'd lost that you couldn't see what was right in front of you." The silence between them stretched, filled with unspoken regrets and might-have-beens. Finally, Sophia stood and walked to the door. "Whatever you're hoping to find out there," she said, "I hope it brings you peace." After she left, Matthew continued his vigil, watching the endless scrolling of the sonar display. Around 3 a.m, he felt the first raindrops through the open window, gentle at first, then increasing in intensity. A storm was approaching, earlier than the weather forecast had predicted. Making a sudden decision, Matthew hurried to the bridge. Finding it momentarily empty except for the night navigator, he quickly accessed the navigation system and entered new coordinates. Adjusting their course slightly to explore an area where his calculations suggested the cruise ship might have been carried if it had been disabled during the storm 6 years ago. He had just finished when Captain Rivera entered, immediately noticing Matthew at the navigation console. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" the captain demanded, striding across the bridge with surprising speed for his bulk. "Just checking our heading," Matthew lied, stepping back from the console. Captain Rivera checked the system, his face darkening. "You've altered our course, without authorization." He grabbed Matthew by the shirt collar, pushing him against the wall. "This is my ship, and I don't care what kind of influence you have with the university. You don't touch my navigation systems." Matthew pushed back, adrenaline surging. "We're less than 20 miles from where my grandparents' ship was last recorded. Just let me check this one area." Their argument was cut short as the ship suddenly lurched violently to the side. Both men stumbled, grabbing onto nearby railings for support. The night navigator called out, "Captain, the storm's intensified. We're looking at gale force winds within minutes." The bridge door burst open as other crew members rushed in, including Sophia, hair disheveled from sleep. "All hands to stations," Captain Rivera shouted, releasing Matthew and moving to take control. "Secure all equipment and prepare for heavy seas." The following hour was chaos as the tropical storm hit with unexpected fury. Rain lashed against the windows while waves crashed over the bow. The research vessel, though well built, was not designed for such severe weather, and it groaned under the assault. Scientists and crew worked frantically to secure valuable equipment and samples, while the bridge crew fought to maintain their course. Matthew found himself working alongside Sophia, lashing down containers of specimens in the main lab, both of them soaked from leaks in the ceiling panels. "I'm sorry," he shouted over the noise of the storm. "I didn't know it would get this bad." "You never do," she shouted back, but there was no time for further conversation, as another violent wave sent them both sliding across the floor. By dawn, the storm had finally begun to subside. Exhausted crew members emerged from their stations to assess the damage. Fortunately, the ship had weathered the storm without serious structural damage, though several pieces of equipment would need repairs. Matthew found Captain Rivera on the bridge, looking haggard after the long night. "Captain," Matthew began, approaching cautiously, "I want to apologize for—" "Save it," Rivera cut him off. "As soon as conditions permit, we're resuming our original course." "Please," Matthew said, dropping all pretense. "I've just received satellite data that shows this area has unusual topographical features not properly recorded on our charts. If we stay just a few more hours, we could—" "More of your wild goose chase?" the captain interrupted. "It's not just about my grandparents anymore," Matthew insisted, pulling out his tablet to show the data. "Look at these readings. There's something here that should be documented regardless. It could be valuable for the university's research." Captain Rivera studied the data, his fatigue evident. After a long moment, he sighed heavily. 4 hours, not a minute more. Then we return to the original mission parameters." Matthew nodded gratefully, already planning how to make the most of the limited time. As he turned to leave the bridge, the radar operator called out, "Captain, Dr. Thompson, you might want to see this." On the newly stabilized radar screen, something unexpected had appeared. A geographical formation not registered on any of their maps, and near it, metallic signals that could only be the remains of a large vessel resting on the ocean floor. Matthew's heart raced as he stared at the bright spot on the radar screen. No one spoke for several long seconds as the implications of what they were seeing sank in. The metallic signatures were unmistakable, large and consistent with the remnants of a cruise ship. "Confirm those coordinates," Captain Rivera ordered, breaking the stunned silence. His voice was tight, professional, but his eyes betrayed surprise as they darted between the radar and Matthew. The navigation officer quickly verified the position, comparing it with their charts. "Sir, this formation doesn't appear on any of our maps, and these metal readings are substantial." Matthew leaned closer to the screen, his fingers hovering just above the bright points of light, as if touching them might make them disappear. "That's it," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "That has to be it." Captain Rivera called for an immediate meeting in the command room. Within 15 minutes, the senior crew and lead scientists crowded around the central table, the atmosphere electric with tension. Satellite images and radar readings were displayed on the main screen, showing the mysterious formation. What appeared to be a small uncharted island, with metal debris scattered along its underwater slope. "This could be scientifically significant," Dr. Reeves admitted grudgingly, studying the topographical readouts. An unmapped island in supposedly well-charted waters. Or it could be a temporary sandbar formation, argued another scientist. We've seen similar anomalies in areas with strong underwater currents. The metal signatures are real, Sophia pointed out, standing slightly apart from Matthew but clearly supportive of the discovery itself. Whatever this is, there's something man-made down there. Captain Rivera's radio crackled to life. The metallic voice of Dean Wilson, the university's research director, filled the room. Captain, our satellite shows you've deviated from the approved research route again. Explanation? Rivera exchanged a glance with Matthew before responding. Sir, we've detected an uncharted geographical formation with significant metallic anomalies. We're assessing whether it warrants investigation. The pause on the other end was palpable. Finally, the dean's voice returned, harsher now. Captain, this expedition has already exhausted its contingency budget. You are explicitly ordered to return to the original research parameters immediately. Sir, with respect, Matthew began, stepping toward the radio. Dr. Thompson, the dean cut him off, apparently recognizing his voice. I've accommodated your personal research interests for years now, but the board has been clear. Return to the approved course, or there will be consequences for everyone involved. Am I understood? The command room fell silent after the transmission ended. All eyes turned to Matthew, who stood frozen, staring at the radar images still displayed on the screen. So close. After 6 years, he was finally so close. The meeting disbanded without a clear decision, though Captain Rivera assured everyone he would follow university protocol. Matthew found himself alone on the deck, staring out at the horizon where the island should be, just beyond visual range. The sky was clear now after the storm, the ocean deceptively calm and innocent of its secrets. Sophia appeared beside him, leaning against the railing. What are you planning? She asked simply, knowing him too well. I can't let this go, Matthew admitted. Not when we're this close. That could be their ship down there. And if it is? She asked gently. What will that change, Matt? Will it bring them back? Will it erase what you said to them? The question struck him like a physical blow. Matthew closed his eyes, the memory of that last conversation flooding back with painful clarity. They had been in his grandparents' living room, the walls lined with photographs of their predictable, comfortable life, together. Harold had been packing his favorite Hawaiian shirts, while Elaine carefully wrapped her pearl necklace in tissue paper. You should come with us, Maddie, his grandmother had suggested. There's an extra cabin. You could use a break from all that studying. Some of us are trying to do something meaningful with our lives, he'd replied with casual cruelty. Not everyone has time for another boring cruise to the same places with the same people taking the same photos. His grandfather had stopped packing, turning to face him. What's really bothering you, son? Nothing, Matthew had snapped. I just think it's sad that you've lived your entire lives playing it safe, never taking risks, never having real adventures, just existing in this little bubble you've created. Matt, his grandmother had exclaimed, genuinely hurt. It's fine, he'd continued, unable to stop himself. Some people are content with predictable, boring lives. I just hope when I'm your age, I'll have better stories to tell than we took another cruise. The next day, they'd boarded their ship. Matthew hadn't said goodbye, telling himself he'd call later to apologize. But later never came. The ship reported engine troubles 3 days into the voyage, and then a storm hit. After that, nothing. As if they'd sailed off the edge of the world. Matthew opened his eyes, returning to the present. I need to know what happened, he said softly. I need to make it right somehow. Sophia touched his arm briefly before walking away, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the vastness of the ocean that had taken his grandparents. That night, Matthew wrote in his journal, formulating a desperate plan. If the captain wouldn't investigate the anomaly, He would have to find another way. The ship's dive equipment included several sets of gear for marine biology research. If he could just get a closer look at those metal signatures, he knew it was reckless, potentially career-ending, and dangerous. But the alternative, sailing away, perhaps never getting another chance, was unthinkable. Around 2 a.m., with most of the crew asleep, Matthew moved silently through the darkened corridors of the research vessel. The night duty officer was focused on monitoring weather patterns after their recent storm encounter, and the few crew members on night shift were mostly in the engine room or on the bridge. Matthew slipped into the research equipment bay, quickly locating the diving gear. His hands trembled slightly as he checked the oxygen tank. It showed 3/4 full, enough for a brief reconnaissance dive. He methodically gathered the wetsuit, mask, fins, and weights, his heart pounding so loudly he feared someone might hear it, echoing in the metal corridors. With practiced movements from years of research dives, Matthew prepared the equipment, double-checking everything. This was madness, he knew. Solo night diving was against every safety protocol, especially after a storm, when currents could be unpredictable. But 6 years of searching had led to this moment, and he couldn't let it slip away. The hardest part was getting the equipment to the stern platform without being seen. Twice, he had to duck into storage closets as crew members passed by. Finally, he reached the small diving platform at the rear of the ship, where the moon provided just enough light to see what he was doing. Matthew slipped into the wetsuit, secured his weight belt, and strapped on the tank. With shaking hands, he attached the regulator and tested the airflow. Everything seemed functional. He sat on the edge of the platform, fins dangling above the dark water, and took a deep breath of night air. The vastness of what he was about to do suddenly hit him. Alone in the ocean at night, with no one knowing where he was. "I'm coming," he whispered to the water, to his grandparents, to whatever remained of them below the surface. Then he put on his mask, inserted the regulator, and slid into the sea. The water was shockingly cold after the warmth of the air, momentarily taking his breath away. Matthew activated his dive light, the beam cutting through the darkness to reveal nothing but endless blue. He oriented himself using the ship's lights above, then began swimming in the direction of the anomaly, using his wrist compass as a guide. The silence of the ocean enveloped him, broken only by the rhythmic sound of his breathing through the regulator. The dive light illuminated only a small tunnel ahead of him, leaving the vast majority of the ocean in terrifying darkness. Every few minutes he would stop to check his compass, making sure he wasn't drifting off course. After about 20 minutes of swimming, Matthew began to worry. He should be getting closer to the bottom now, but his depth gauge showed he was still in relatively shallow water. Had he gone in the wrong direction? Just as panic began to rise in his chest, his tank suddenly made an ominous sputtering sound, and his breathing became noticeably harder. Checking his pressure gauge in alarm, Matthew saw the needle dropping rapidly. Something was wrong with the tank, a leak, or perhaps it hadn't been as full as he'd thought. His steady breathing quickened as fear took hold, each breath now a conscious effort. In the growing oxygen deprivation, vivid flashbacks began to flood his mind. He was back in his grandparents' living room, seeing the hurt in his grandmother's eyes as he called their lives boring. He saw his grandfather's quiet dignity in the face of his cruel words. He felt again the hollow emptiness when he'd learned their ship was missing, the knowledge that his last words to them had been so callous. "I'm sorry," he tried to say, but only bubbles emerged from his regulator. The water pressed in around him, dark and unforgiving. His movements became sluggish as the oxygen depletion affected his brain, the dive light wavering in his weakening grip. Just as darkness began to creep in, at the edges of his vision, a second light appeared in the water, moving, searching. Then another, powerful beams cutting through the darkness, finding him drifting semi-conscious. Hands grabbed him, pulling him upward. His last thought before losing consciousness was of his grandmother's pearl necklace sinking slowly through dark water. Matthew awoke in the ship's infirmary, the harsh fluorescent lights stabbing at his eyes. Sophia sat beside his bed, her expression a mixture of relief and fury. "You absolute idiot," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "You nearly died out there." "How?" Matthew croaked, his throat raw. "I couldn't sleep. I went to your cabin to talk and found you gone." Sophia ran a hand through her disheveled hair. "When I saw the dive equipment missing, I knew exactly what you'd done. We barely found you in time." Before Matthew could respond, the infirmary door swung open and Captain Rivera entered, his face grim. "Dr. Thompson," he said coldly, "you're confined to the infirmary until we reach port. You'll remain under constant supervision for the remainder of this voyage." As the captain turned to leave, Matthew noticed something clutched in his hand, a small notebook. Just before the door closed, Matthew caught a glimpse of its open pages, a series of coordinates carefully marked in precise handwriting, including ones very near to where the mysterious island was located. The implications hit him like a physical blow. The captain had known about the island all along, marking its position in his private notebook, but had kept that knowledge to himself for years. Matthew stared at the notebook in Captain Rivera's hand, his mind racing despite the fog of exhaustion. Those coordinates, so precisely marked in the captain's neat handwriting, couldn't be a coincidence. The realization made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with his recent near drowning. Captain Rivera had known about the island all along. As the door closed behind the captain, Matthew tried to push himself upright, only to be gently but firmly pushed back down by Sophia. "Don't even think about it," she warned, adjusting the IV line attached to his arm. "You're severely dehydrated and experiencing mild hypoxia. The doctor says you need to rest." "The captain's notebook," Matthew said, his voice still raspy. "Did you see it? He had coordinates marked. Coordinates for that island. He's known about it this whole time." Sophia's expression shifted from concern to skepticism. "Matt, you were oxygen deprived. You might have seen—" "I know what I saw," Matthew insisted, frustration building. "Why else would he be so determined to leave the area? Why fight so hard against investigating?" Before Sophia could respond, the ship's doctor entered, a middle-aged man with wire-rimmed glasses and a perpetually worried expression. He checked Matthew's vitals with practiced efficiency. "You're extremely lucky, Dr. Thompson," the doctor said sternly. "Another few minutes out there and we'd be having a very different conversation. I'm keeping you under observation for at least 24 hours. Matthew nodded weakly, his body finally registering the true exhaustion of his ordeal. Despite his burning questions about the captain's notebook, his eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep filled with dreams of dark water and sinking pearls. When he awoke several hours later, the infirmary was dimly lit, suggesting it was night. His attempt to sit up revealed that his body felt like it had been hit by a truck. Every muscle ached, and his lungs burned with each breath. The events of his ill-fated dive came rushing back, along with the memory of the captain's notebook. Matthew carefully pulled himself upright, noticing that the IV had been removed from his arm. He swung his legs over the side of the bed, testing his strength. His head swam momentarily, but the dizziness passed. Through the infirmary window, he could see the captain moving across the deck, notebook in hand, heading toward his quarters. A sudden determination seized Matthew. He needed to see that notebook again, to confirm what he thought he'd seen. But how could he approach the captain without arousing suspicion? As he pondered this, the door opened and Sophia entered with a tray of food. "You're awake," she observed, setting the tray on the bedside table. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been through a washing machine," Matthew admitted, gratefully accepting the cup of water she offered. "Have you talked to the captain since he was here?" Sophia's expression became guarded. "Matt, I think you should focus on recovering. The captain has agreed not to report your unauthorized dive to the university if you cease this investigation." "That's generous of him," Matthew replied, unable to keep the sarcasm from his voice. "Doesn't that strike you as odd? Why would he protect me unless he has something to hide? Or maybe he just doesn't want to destroy your career over one stupid decision," Sophia countered, her patience visibly wearing thin. "Not everything is a conspiracy." Matthew took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "Soph, I need to ask you something important. When you and the rescue team found me, how far was I from the ship?" Sophia frowned. "About half a mile, maybe more. Why?" "And in which direction was I drifting?" "Northeast, I think. The currents were pushing you." She stopped, suddenly understanding. "Toward the anomaly." Matthew nodded. "I nearly made it, before my tank failed." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I need to see the captain's notebook." "Absolutely not," Sophia whispered harshly. "You almost died last night, and now you want to, what, steal the captain's personal property? This has gone too far." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden lurch of the ship. The lights flickered, and a low rumble of thunder could be heard in the distance. Sophia steadied herself against the wall as another, stronger wave hit the vessel. "Another storm?" Matthew asked, alarm creeping into his voice. "The meteorologist warned there might be a second system following the first," Sophia replied, moving to the window. Outside, the previously clear sky had transformed into an ominous mass of dark clouds. "This one looks worse." Minutes later, the ship's alarm sounded, calling all hands to stations. Sophia hesitated, clearly torn between her duty to prepare the research lab for rough seas and her responsibility to watch over Matthew. "Go," he urged. "I'm fine. I'll stay put." After she left, Matthew listened to the increasing chaos outside the infirmary door, hurried footsteps, shouted orders, the growing howl of wind. Despite his promise to Sophia, he slowly got to his feet, testing his balance. His body protested, but his determination was stronger. If everyone was focused on preparing for the storm, this might be his only chance to find answers. Matthew opened the infirmary door cautiously. The corridor was empty, though he could hear frantic activity from both the research lab and the bridge. Moving as quickly as his weakened state allowed, he made his way toward the captain's quarters. The ship pitched violently as he reached the captain's door, throwing him against the wall. The storm was intensifying rapidly, much faster than the previous one. Matthew steadied himself, then tried the door handle. To his surprise, it turned easily. The captain had apparently left in too much hurry to lock it. Inside, the captain's quarters were sparse but orderly. A single photo of a younger Rivera in naval uniform stood on the desk next to a stack of logbooks and navigation charts. Matthew quickly began searching for the notebook he'd seen earlier, conscious that every second increased his risk of discovery. He found it in the top desk drawer, a weathered leather notebook filled with the captain's precise handwriting. Matthew's hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, scanning for the coordinates he'd glimpsed. There they were, latitude and longitude markings for various locations, including one set that matched the position of the mysterious island. But what made Matthew's blood run cold was the date next to these particular coordinates, exactly 6 years ago, just days after his grandparents' cruise ship had disappeared. A deafening crack of thunder shook the ship, followed by the lights going completely out. In the sudden darkness, Matthew heard a sizzling sound and smelled electrical burning. The emergency lights flickered on seconds later, bathing the cabin in an eerie red glow. Over the intercom, a voice announced that lightning had struck the main communication antenna. Matthew quickly photographed the relevant pages with his phone before replacing the notebook exactly as he'd found it. As he turned to leave, a particularly violent wave hit the ship, sending him crashing into a cabinet. Something fell to the floor, a metal box that had been stored on top. It sprang open upon impact, spilling its contents across the floor. Matthew froze. Among the scattered papers and old photographs was something unmistakable, A newspaper clipping about the disappearance of the Crystal Voyager cruise ship, the very vessel his grandparents had been on. Why would the captain keep this? Before he could investigate further, voices approached in the corridor. Matthew hastily gathered the spilled items, shoving them back into the box and returning it to the cabinet. He slipped out of the cabin just as two crew members rounded the corner, pretending to steady himself against the wall as if he'd just left the infirmary. "Sir, you shouldn't be up during the storm," one of them called out, hurrying to assist him. "Just needed to use the bathroom," Matthew lied, allowing them to help him back to the infirmary. The storm raged for hours, more violent than the first. From his bed in the infirmary, Matthew could hear the creaking protests of the ship's hull as it was, battered by massive waves. Equipment crashed to the floor despite being secured, and at one point, water began seeping under the door from a leak somewhere in the corridor. By dawn, the fury had finally subsided, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. Sophia appeared looking exhausted, her clothes damp and her hair disheveled. "How bad is it?" Matthew asked. "Pretty bad," she admitted, sinking into the chair beside his bed. "The communication system is completely fried. The satellite phone is our only link to the mainland now, and some of the research equipment—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "We lost the advanced sonar array and 2 of the underwater drones." "What's the captain saying?" "He's ordered a damage assessment. We're dead in the water until the engineers can repair the propulsion system." Sophia rubbed her eyes tiredly. "But there is one piece of news you might find interesting." Matthew sat up straighter. "What?" "The storm pushed us significantly off course. We're now less than 2 miles from your mystery island." Matthew's heart raced. "Can we see it from the ship?" Sophia nodded reluctantly. "It's visible from the starboard observation deck." "But Matt, no one's going anywhere until the ship is repaired. The captain has been very clear about that." Despite her warning, Matthew was determined to at least see the island with his own eyes. As soon as Sophia left to get some much-needed rest, he carefully made his way to the observation deck, using the walls for support when his legs threatened to give out. The deck was deserted, everyone else busy with repair efforts. Matthew moved to the railing, raising a pair of binoculars he'd borrowed from the infirmary's emergency kit. And there it was, a small, lush island rising from the blue waters, palm trees swaying in the post-storm breeze. His heart pounded as he scanned the shoreline, looking for any sign of wreckage or human presence. Then he saw it, a flash of color on the distant beach that didn't match, the natural palette of sand and vegetation. Something bright, almost like fabric. Matthew adjusted the focus, his hands shaking with excitement or weakness or both. It was still too far to make out details, but there was definitely something there, something that didn't belong on an uninhabited island. Behind him, voices approached, the captain discussing repair priorities with the chief engineer. Matthew quickly lowered the binoculars but remained at the railing, determined to confront Rivera about what he knew. "Dr. Thompson," the captain said coldly when he noticed Matthew, "you should be resting." "I was just looking at the island," Matthew replied, watching the captain's reaction carefully. "Seems like fate keeps pushing us toward it." The captain's expression remained neutral, but Matthew noticed a slight tightening around his eyes. "Once repairs are complete, we'll return to our original course." "Even though we're so close now, wouldn't it make sense to send a team to the island for fresh water and materials while repairs are underway?" The chief engineer spoke up before the captain could respond. "We could use some natural materials to reinforce the temporary repairs. Palm fiber is surprisingly effective for certain applications." Captain Rivera looked trapped, his gaze moving between the engineer's expectant face and Matthew's challenging stare. Finally, he nodded curtly. "Fine. We'll send a small exploration team, for supplies only." As the captain turned to leave, Matthew called after him, "Captain, I couldn't help noticing something in your notebook earlier." Coordinates marked near this island from 6 years ago. Quite a coincidence that it's the same time my grandparents disappeared in these waters." The captain froze mid-step, then slowly turned back. "I suggest you focus on your recovery, Dr. Thompson, and leave navigation matters to those qualified to handle them." His voice was dangerously quiet. "And I suggest you stay out of my personal belongings if you want to remain on this ship." As the captain walked away, Matthew returned his gaze to the distant island, focusing on that tantalizing spot of color on the beach. During a momentary lull in the conversation between the captain and engineer, Matthew observed a notebook fall from Rivera's pocket. The same notebook with the suspicious coordinates marking this exact island, suggesting he might have known of its existence all along. Matthew watched as Captain Rivera hurriedly picked up his fallen notebook, stuffing it back into his pocket with unusual haste. Their eyes met briefly, Rivera's filled with a mixture of anger and something else Matthew couldn't quite place. Was it fear? The captain turned away abruptly, barking orders to the crew about preparing a small expedition to the island. "I'm going on that expedition," Matthew announced, his voice stronger than he felt. Rivera turned back, his expression hardening. "Absolutely not. You're still recovering from nearly killing yourself on that unauthorized dive." "With all due respect, Captain," Matthew countered, "I'm the only oceanographer on board familiar with coastal geological formations. If you're looking for resources to repair the ship, my expertise would be valuable." He held the captain's gaze steadily, the unspoken challenge hanging between them. After a tense moment, Rivera relented with visible reluctance. "Fine, but you stay with the group at all times. First sign of trouble or disobedience, and you're back on the ship. Understood?" Matthew nodded, hiding his triumph. An hour later, as the expedition team prepared to depart, Sophia approached him on the deck, where he was checking the supplies in his backpack. "I heard you're going ashore," she said, concern evident in her voice. "Are you sure that's wise? You nearly died yesterday." "I've never been more sure of anything," Matthew replied, closing his pack. "Something's on that island, Sophia. Something connected to my grandparents. I can feel it." Sophia studied his face for a moment, then sighed. "Just be careful, and take these." She handed him an emergency satellite beacon and a first aid kit. "If anything happens, activate the beacon immediately." The small motorized dinghy carried 6 people toward the shore. Matthew, the chief engineer, 2 research assistants, and 2 crew members. As they approached the island, Matthew's heart raced. The shoreline was pristine, untouched by human development, white sand giving way to lush tropical vegetation. If his grandparents had somehow reached this place, what had they found? Had they survived, even briefly? Captain Rivera's voice crackled over the radio as they neared the beach. "Remember, you have 2 hours. Collect fresh water, palm fronds, and any usable wood. Nothing else, and stay together." The dinghy's bow slid onto the sand with a gentle hiss. As Matthew stepped onto the island, a strange feeling washed over him, part dread, part anticipation. He was walking where his grandparents might have walked, breathing the same air they might have breathed in their final days. The expedition leader, a no-nonsense engineer named Rodriguez, quickly organized the team. "Garcia and Chen, head inland to locate a freshwater source. Williams and I will collect palm fronds near the tree line. Dr. Thompson and Evans, survey the beach for driftwood and any materials we can use for repairs." This was exactly what Matthew had hoped for, a legitimate reason to search the shoreline where he'd spotted the unusual color from the ship. He and Evans, a quiet oceanography student, began walking the beach's perimeter, gathering pieces of driftwood and piling them for collection. "I need to check something over there," Matthew said casually, pointing toward the section of beach where he'd seen the flash of color. "Looks like there might be more substantial driftwood." Evans nodded, continuing to gather smaller pieces nearby. As Matthew moved farther down the beach, he constantly, glanced back, making sure the others were occupied with their tasks. When he was reasonably certain no one was watching, he quickened his pace, heading directly toward the spot he'd observed from the ship. The bright midday sun beat down on his shoulders as he rounded a small outcropping of rocks. And there it was, a patch of faded blue fabric partially buried in the sand, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Matthew's heart pounded as he knelt beside it, carefully brushing away the sand. His hands trembled as he uncovered more of the fabric. Unmistakably a Hawaiian shirt, its once vibrant blue pattern now faded by sun and salt, but still recognizable. It was the exact style his grandfather had favored on every vacation, the same pattern he'd been wearing in the last photo Matthew had of him before boarding the cruise. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice breaking. With renewed urgency, Matthew dug further into the sand surrounding the shirt. Nearby, he uncovered another piece of fabric, yellow with a floral pattern, weathered almost beyond recognition, but Matthew knew instantly it was from his grandmother's favorite dress. His vision blurred with tears as he continued to dig, moving sand with increasingly desperate motions. His fingers struck something hard, a rectangular object buried deeper than the clothing. Matthew excavated carefully around it, revealing a waterproof container, the kind photographers use to protect their equipment. His hands shook so badly he could barely work the latches, but finally, the case opened with a satisfying click. Inside, protected from the elements, lay a simple notebook bound in leather, its pages yellowed but intact. Matthew recognized his grandmother's handwriting immediately, the elegant penmanship she'd developed during decades as an elementary school teacher. The first entry was dated just one day after the cruise ship had disappeared. June 15th. The ship sank so quickly. Harold and I were lucky to reach this life raft. The storm pushed us for hours before we saw land. We are alone, but we are alive. Harold says we must keep hope that someone will find us. Matthew's throat tightened as he turned the pages, reading entries that chronicled his grandparents' first days on the island, their search for water, their construction of a simple shelter, their careful rationing of the few supplies that had washed ashore with them. June 20th. Harold found a freshwater spring inland. We've moved our shelter closer to it. He's already talking about building something more permanent. Always the practical one, my Harold. I catch him looking at the horizon sometimes, but he always smiles when he notices me watching. We speak often of Matthew. Harold says when we're rescued, we'll have quite the adventure to tell our grandson. Not so predictable now, are we? The words struck Matthew like a physical blow. They had thought of him even here, even after what he'd said to them. He continued reading, learning how they'd established a life on the island, creating a small garden with seeds from fruits they found, building a more substantial shelter, marking the days on a makeshift calendar. September 8th. 3 months now. Harold has built us a lovely little home. He jokes that it's our retirement cottage with an ocean view. We've established routines, mornings for gathering food and maintaining the shelter, afternoons for Harold's projects, currently a rain catchment system, and my attempts to keep a record of the birds here. Evenings for stories. We tell each other memories from our life together, to keep them fresh. Last night we both spoke of Matthew's graduation, how proud we were. Harold says Matthew's last words to us don't matter. He's young, he said. When you're young, you can't imagine that quiet lives can be rich ones. Matthew wiped tears from his eyes, turning page after page, absorbing the extraordinary account of his boring grandparents surviving against all odds. They had adapted, innovated, and even found joy in their situation. The diary detailed Harold teaching Elaine to fish, Elaine showing Harold how to weave palm fronds, both of them watching meteor showers on clear nights, naming stars after family members. Then, 2 years into their island life, the entries changed. July 30th. Harold is sick. More than just a cold this time. He's been coughing for weeks, and today there was blood. I'm terrified. The subsequent entries documented her desperate attempts to care for him, using the limited first aid supplies they had salvaged and medicinal plants they had discovered. Matthew's heart ached as he read his grandmother's increasingly desperate words. August 15th. I lost him today. My Harold, my companion for 53 years, my castaway partner. He went peacefully, holding my hand, telling me to keep hoping for rescue, to tell Matthew he was wrong. We had the greatest adventure of our lives here, together. I buried him near our little home under the flowering tree he liked so much. I am alone now. Matthew could barely see the pages through his tears. He had never imagined such strength in his quiet, unassuming grandmother. The entries continued, though less frequent, documenting her continued survival alone. The final entry, dated nearly 4 years after the shipwreck, was written in a shakier hand. I know my time is coming. I've been weaker each day. Yesterday I gathered the strength to bring our clothes to the beach and arrange them where they might be seen. I've placed Harold's blue shirt and my yellow dress, along with the pearl necklace Matthew gave me, where perhaps someday they might be found. If anyone ever reads this, please tell Matthew that his grandparents had an adventure after all, our last one and our best one. Tell him we were never angry, only hoping he would learn that a life doesn't need to be extraordinary to be worthy of love, and that we loved him, always. Matthew clutched the diary to his chest, overwhelmed by grief and regret, and a strange new feeling, pride. His grandparents, whom he had dismissed as boring and conventional, had shown more courage and resilience than he had ever given them credit for. So lost was he in the diary that Matthew didn't notice how much time had passed until he heard distant shouting. The expedition team was calling for him. How long had he been reading? With a start, he realized the sun had moved significantly across the sky. He had been so absorbed in his grandparents' story that he'd lost track of time completely. Hastily, Matthew secured the diary in its waterproof case and gathered the weathered clothes. He couldn't leave these precious items behind. They were all he had left of his grandparents now. As he stood to return to the group, something caught his eye, a glint of white partially buried near where the dress had been. Kneeling quickly, he brushed away the sand to reveal his grandmother's pearl necklace, the clasp broken, but the pearls still attached to the string, miraculously preserved. Matthew climbed to higher ground, intending to signal the search party, but what he saw froze him in place. From this vantage point, he could see clear across the bay to where the Esperanza had been anchored. The ship was moving, its bow already pointed away from the island, engines visibly churning the water behind it. "No!" Matthew shouted, waving his arms frantically. "Wait!" But it was useless. The ship was too far away to hear or see him. As he watched in horror, the Esperanza picked up speed, disappearing around the island's northern edge. He was stranded, abandoned on the very same island where his grandparents had lived and died, left behind just as they had been. Desperation surged through Matthew as he watched the Esperanza fade into the horizon, leaving only churning wake where the ship had been anchored moments before. He stood frozen on the elevated outcrop, arms still raised in futile gesture, disbelief paralyzing him as the reality of his situation sank in. "They left me," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. "They actually left me behind." The enormity of his predicament crashed over him like a physical wave. He was abandoned on an unmapped island, with only the clothes he wore, a half-empty water bottle, and the precious items he'd recovered from his grandparents. No radio, no supplies, no way to call for help. Panic rose in his chest, constricting his breathing. Matthew dropped to his knees. The waterproof case containing the diary clutched tightly against his chest. His scientific mind raced through scenarios, each more hopeless than the last. The ship might not discover his absence for hours. Even if they turned back immediately, the growing storm clouds on the horizon suggested another weather system approaching. "Think," Matthew. Think, he scolded himself, forcing deep breaths to calm the rising tide of fear. He checked his pockets, taking inventory of his meager resources. The small first aid kit Sophia had given him, a pocket multi-tool, his nearly dead cell phone with no signal, and the emergency satellite beacon. With trembling fingers, he activated the beacon, knowing it was his best hope for rescue. Though in these remote waters, response could take days. The wind picked up, carrying the unmistakable scent of rain. Matthew looked at the darkening sky with growing concern. He needed shelter before the storm hit, and with no supplies or equipment, his best option was to follow his grandparents' example. The diary, he muttered, carefully opening the waterproof case again. He flipped through the pages, searching for descriptions of where they had first taken shelter. His grandmother's elegant handwriting provided the answer. June 16th. We found a cave in the rock formation near the eastern shore. It's dry and protected from the wind. Harold says it's a blessing, though I find it rather damp. Still, it's better than another night exposed to the elements. Matthew carefully repacked his grandparents' belongings and began making his way down the slope, following the shoreline eastward. The wind grew stronger with each passing minute, whipping the palm trees into frenzied motion and sending the first spatters of rain against his face. Half an hour of difficult trudging through increasingly heavy rain brought him to a rocky outcropping that matched his grandmother's description. A dark opening was visible among the stones, partially obscured by vegetation. Matthew pushed through the tangled growth, relieved to find a space large enough to stand in, dry and protected from the elements. As the storm intensified outside, Matthew used his phone's remaining battery to illuminate the cave. The beam revealed a space roughly 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide, with a surprisingly level floor of packed sand. Perfect for emergency shelter, exactly as his grandparents had described. You were here, he whispered, running his hand along the smooth stone wall. Right here. As the light swept across the cave's interior, Matthew noticed markings on the wall, deliberate scratches in orderly rows. Moving closer, he realized with a jolt what he was seeing. A calendar. Vertical lines grouped in sets of 7, with horizontal lines crossing through them. His grandfather had been keeping track of days. Matthew's throat tightened as he counted the marks. Over 100 days recorded here before they'd apparently moved to their more permanent settlement. More than 3 months in this cave, waiting for a rescue that never came. The rain pounded against the island like a furious drummer, and the cave's entrance became a curtain of water. Matthew settled deeper inside, arranging his precious findings carefully. With nothing else to do but wait out the storm, he reopened the diary, using the last of his phone's battery to read more details about his grandparents' survival. June 25th. Harold has started making drawings on the cave wall. Not just the calendar to track days, but little sketches of the island, the ocean, birds he's seen. He says it helps him remember that the world is bigger than our little cave. I've started my own project, weaving palm fronds into mats for sleeping. We're becoming quite the primitive artists. Matthew switched off his phone to conserve what little battery remained. In the dim light filtering through the rain-drenched entrance, he examined the walls more carefully. Yes, there were drawings, faded but discernible. Simple line drawings of waves, a boat, seabirds, and what appeared to be 2 stick figures holding hands beneath a palm tree. I never knew you could draw, Grandpa, Matthew murmured, tracing the images with his fingertips. The simple art touched him more deeply than any masterpiece ever had. As daylight faded and the storm continued its assault on the island, Matthew arranged the Hawaiian shirt and yellow dress fabric as a makeshift pillow. Exhaustion from the emotional discoveries and his still recovering body overtook him, and he drifted into a troubled sleep, lulled by the rhythm of rain against stone. His dreams were vivid, populated by his grandparents as he'd never seen them. His grandmother, her silver hair tied back, expertly weaving palm fronds. His grandfather, sleeves rolled up, digging irrigation channels for a small garden. They were talking, laughing, living, not just surviving. In the dream, Matthew approached them, desperate to apologize for his cruel words, but they couldn't see or hear him. He was a ghost in their world, present but unable to connect. "I was wrong," he cried out in the dream. "Your lives weren't boring. I was the one who couldn't see." He awoke with a start, tears wet on his face. The storm had passed, and morning light streamed into the cave. Matthew sat up, momentarily disoriented. Then reality rushed back. He was stranded, alone on the island where his grandparents had lived their final years. Strange as it seemed, alongside the fear and uncertainty, Matthew felt something unexpected: connection. He was experiencing what they had experienced, seeing what they had seen, following their footsteps in the most literal way possible. Matthew ventured to the cave entrance. The storm had left the island glistening and vibrant, water droplets sparkling on every leaf and petal. Birds called from the forest canopy, celebrating the return of sunshine. It was, despite his circumstances, breathtakingly beautiful. His first priority was finding fresh water. The diary mentioned a spring inland, and Matthew was determined to locate it. Keeping the waterproof case with the diary and other items carefully secured, he began making his way into the interior of the island, following the most well-defined animal trail he could find. The tropical vegetation grew denser as he moved away from the shore, the humidity wrapping around him like a warm blanket. Insects buzzed and small creatures rustled in the undergrowth. Matthew tried to recall everything he knew about tropical flora, identifying edible fruits and plants that might sustain him until rescue arrived. After about 40 minutes of hiking, he heard it, the soft burble of flowing water. Following the sound, Matthew pushed through a curtain of vines to discover a small but steady spring emerging from rocks, forming a clear pool before continuing as a narrow stream down toward the coast. "Thank you, Grandma," he said aloud, knowing her diary had saved him hours of desperate searching. He knelt and drank deeply, the cool, sweet water more satisfying than any beverage he'd ever tasted. With his immediate thirst quenched, Matthew returned to the diary, searching for the next clue, the location of the more permanent shelter his grandparents had built. July 10th. "We've finished our new home today." Harold found a perfect clearing surrounded by fruit trees about half a mile inland from the eastern beach. He's quite proud of the structure, a proper little house with walls of woven palm and a sturdy roof that shouldn't leak when the rains come. "I've planted the seeds from the fruits we've been eating in a pattern around our home." Harold laughed and called me the island gardener, but I told him that someday we might be grateful for a reliable food source closer to home. He just smiled and kissed me. After 30 years together, I still love that smile. Matthew oriented himself based on the diary's description and began walking in what he hoped was the right direction. The island wasn't large, perhaps 3 miles across at its widest point, but the dense vegetation made navigation challenging. The sun climbed higher as he searched, its heat intensifying. Just as frustration began to set in, Matthew noticed something unusual about the trees ahead. They were too orderly, arranged in what appeared to be a circle. As he drew closer, he realized these were fruit trees, mango, papaya, and what looked like citrus, planted in a deliberate pattern. His grandmother's garden, grown wild but still bearing fruit, which meant Matthew pushed through the final stretch of vegetation and emerged into a clearing. His heart nearly stopped. There, weathered by years of tropical storms but still standing, was a small structure of wood and palm thatch. Carved into the main support beam above the doorway, the words Lar dos Thompson were still visible, Portuguese for home of the Thompsons. Matthew's trembling fingers reached out to touch the weathered inscription on the doorway. Lar dos Thompson. Home of the Thompsons. The simple phrase carved into the wood sent a wave of emotion crashing through him. Standing before the humble structure his grandparents had built, Matthew felt both incredibly close to them and painfully aware of their absence. He hesitated at the threshold, suddenly overwhelmed by the significance of entering their final home. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the creaking door open and stepped inside. The interior was bathed in dappled sunlight filtering through gaps in the thatched roof, illuminating a space that was modest but remarkably well organized. The single room contained evidence of ingenious adaptation to island life. A bed frame constructed from driftwood and lashed together with woven fibers stood against one wall, its mattress long since decayed to dust. A table fashioned from a large piece of salvaged wood was positioned beneath the room's only window, likely salvaged from the cruise ship's wreckage, which allowed light and air to circulate. Simple shelves lined another wall, holding an assortment of containers made from coconut shells and hollowed gourds. "You built all this," Matthew whispered in awe, turning slowly to take in every detail. His grandfather had been a math teacher, not a carpenter, yet he had created a functional living space using only what the island provided and what little had washed ashore. On the central table lay his grandfather's pocket watch, the gold case tarnished, but still intact. Matthew picked it up gently, noticing it had stopped at 3:47. He wondered if that marked the moment of his grandfather's passing. Beside the watch sat a water-damaged book, one of his grandmother's favorites, Pride and Prejudice. The pages were warped and yellowed, but she had clearly treasured this salvaged piece of her former life. With reverent care, Matthew explored the cabin, each discovery revealing more about his grandparents' resourcefulness. A collection of fishing tools hung on one wall, hooks crafted from bone and wire, nets woven from plant fibers. Beneath the bed, he found a box containing carefully preserved seeds, labeled in his grandmother's handwriting: tomato, pepper, mystery fruit, sweet. The ingenuity on display was humbling. A rain catchment system directed water from the roof into large shells and salvaged containers. A stone fireplace in one corner showed signs of regular use, with crude cooking implements arranged nearby. His grandfather's math skills had been put to practical use. On one wall hung detailed drawings of the island's geography, with calculations for distances and tide patterns. Matthew discovered a shelf of tools that testified to Harold Thompson's adaptability: a hammer made from a heavy stone, lashed to a wooden handle, chisels crafted from sharpened metal scraps, saws created from jagged pieces of the cruise ship's debris. Each item represented hours of labor and problem-solving. In a corner near the bed, Matthew found a worn sketchbook. Opening it revealed dozens of detailed drawings, his grandmother's artistic side, which he'd never known about. She had documented the island's birds, plants, and landscapes with surprising skill. Interspersed among the natural studies were portraits of her husband, capturing his determined expressions as he worked on their shelter, fished, or simply gazed at the sunset. On the final pages were several sketches of Matthew himself, drawn from memory. Matthew at his high school graduation, at family Christmas gatherings, laughing with his grandfather over a chessboard. The last drawing showed Matthew as a child, asleep on his grandfather's lap. The caption read simply, "Our Matthew, always loved." The tears came then, hot and unstoppable. Matthew sank onto the earth floor, clutching the sketchbook to his chest, finally allowing himself to fully grieve for the remarkable people he had so casually dismissed as boring. Hours passed as Matthew meticulously examined every object in the cabin, creating a mental inventory of his grandparents' island life. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows through the window, he discovered a wooden box tucked beneath a loose floorboard. Inside were several letters, carefully folded and addressed to him. Letters his grandparents had written with no real hope of delivery. With trembling hands, Matthew unfolded the first one, dated about 6 months after the shipwreck. "Dearest Matthew, if by some miracle you ever read these words, know that your grandfather and I are surviving our unexpected adventure. Quite well, Harold has become surprisingly adept at fishing, and I've discovered that my gardening hobby has practical applications. We talk about you often, remembering your graduation, your first scientific paper, the time you tried to build that miniature volcano in our kitchen. Your last words to us were harsh, but please don't carry that burden. Youth sees differently than age, and one day you'll understand that quiet lives can hold their own kind of adventure. We are not angry, just hopeful that life teaches you its gentler lessons with less drama than it has taught us. With all our love, Grandma Elaine. Matthew read each letter, moving chronologically through their island years. The early ones were hopeful, filled with practical details of their survival and affectionate family memories. Later letters, after his grandfather's illness began, grew more philosophical. The final letter, written in his grandmother's increasingly shaky hand, brought fresh tears. My dearest Matthew, I don't believe I'll write many more letters. The pain in my chest has grown worse, and I find myself resting more than moving these days. I've made peace with my journey ending on this beautiful island alongside your grandfather. I want you to know that despite the circumstances, these years were not a tragedy. Harold and I discovered strengths we never knew we possessed. We witnessed sunsets that would make artists weep. We held each other under blankets of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. We loved each other more deeply in this simple place than in all our comfortable years before. You called our lives boring once. Perhaps they seemed so. But a well-tended garden, a hand held for decades, a life built on quiet commitment. These contain their own profound adventures. I hope you discover this yourself someday. We forgive you. We love you. We are proud of you. Always, Grandma. On the ship, thousands of miles away, Sophia paced the deck anxiously. 6 hours had passed since the expedition team had returned to the Esperanza, and she had just discovered that Matthew was not among them. Her confrontation with the expedition leader had been explosive. What do you mean you thought he was already on board? She demanded. Didn't you take a head count before leaving? Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. There was confusion during the emergency recall. The storm was approaching faster than expected, and the captain ordered immediate evacuation. So you just left without making sure everyone was accounted for? Sophia's voice rose dangerously. The captain said, I don't care what the captain said, Sophia interrupted. We need to go back immediately. That confrontation had led to another with Captain Rivera, who had initially refused to turn the ship around, citing the approaching storm. It had taken Sophia gathering support from the entire scientific team and several crew members to force the issue. Now she watched the captain on the bridge, issuing reluctant orders to prepare for a return to the island once the storm passed. Something about his behavior seemed off. Too nervous, too evasive. She recalled the notebook Matthew had mentioned and made a decision. Under the pretense of retrieving scientific equipment, Sophia slipped into the captain's quarters while he was occupied on the bridge. She found the notebook in his desk drawer, exactly where Matthew had described it. What she discovered inside made her blood run cold. The notebook contained not just coordinates of the island, dated from 6 years ago, but a hastily scribbled note. Survivors sighted on beach, at least 2. Cannot investigate. Cargo compromised. Marked location for future reference. Sophia stared at the page in horror. The captain had seen survivors, likely Matthew's grandparents, and deliberately chosen not to report or rescue them. Matthew had been right all along. Back on the island, Matthew spent the remaining daylight methodically documenting everything in the cabin, cataloging his grandparents' possessions and innovations. He wanted to understand exactly how they had lived, to honor their survival by acknowledging every clever adaptation they had made. As evening approached, Matthew stepped outside to gather some of the fruit from his grandmother's garden. The trees she had planted years ago were now mature, providing abundant mangoes, papayas, and citrus. He collected an armful, and returned to the cabin to sort through more of his grandparents' belongings. Behind the cabin, hidden under a carefully constructed lean-to of palm fronds, Matthew discovered something unexpected: the framework of what appeared to be a raft. Large driftwood logs had been lashed together with rope and vine, forming a base about 8 feet square. Nearby lay more materials: hollow bamboo poles, coconut fiber rope, and broad palm leaves that could serve as a sail. His grandfather had been building an escape vessel, away off the island. Based on the state of the construction and the diary entries, Harold Thompson had likely been working on it when his illness began. After his death, Elaine, less physically strong and lacking technical knowledge, had been unable to complete it. Matthew ran his hand along the weathered wood, feeling a deep connection to his grandfather's determination. "You never gave up," he said softly. "Right to the end, you were trying to get back to family." As darkness fell, Matthew returned to the cabin and lit a small fire in the stone hearth, using his grandfather's flint and steel method described in the diary. By firelight, he continued reading entries, learning more about their daily lives, their struggles, and moments of unexpected joy. He slept that night on the floor of their cabin, wrapped in his grandfather's faded Hawaiian shirt, and feeling, despite his predicament, strangely at peace. For the first time, he truly understood his grandparents' lives, not as dull or predictable, but as rich with quiet strength and enduring love. The next morning, Matthew woke with purpose. He would honor his grandparents by surviving as they had, using their knowledge and tools. He spent the day repairing the cabin's roof, gathering fresh fruit, and studying the raft's design, considering whether he could complete it himself. On the third day, when hope of immediate rescue had begun to fade, Matthew climbed to the island's highest point to check if the emergency beacon was still functioning. From this vantage point, he spotted something on the horizon, a tiny speck that gradually revealed itself to be a ship. The Esperanza was returning. Relief flooded through him, but also a surprising reluctance. In just 3 days, this island had transformed from a place of abandonment to a sacred space where he felt profoundly connected to his grandparents. Leaving meant saying goodbye to them again. While Matthew watched the approaching ship from the hilltop, Sophia stood on the Esperanza's deck, clutching the captain's damning notebook. She had discovered a truth so shocking, it changed everything. The captain had not only known about the island and possible survivors all along, but had deliberately kept that information secret for years, maintaining a conspiracy of silence that had cost 2 lives. Sophia stood on the deck of the Esperanza, the captain's notebook clutched tightly in her hand, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The revelation within its pages burned in her mind like a brand. Captain Rivera had known about the island and its survivors for 6 years, and had deliberately chosen to keep that information secret. Her hands shook slightly as she carefully tucked the notebook into her jacket pocket. This evidence couldn't remain hidden any longer. With determined steps, Sophia headed to the ship's laboratory where Dr. Chen and Dr. Reeves, 2 senior scientists she trusted, were repairing equipment damaged during the storm. Both looked up as she entered, immediately noticing her troubled expression. "I need to show you something," Sophia said, her voice low but urgent. "But first, I need your word that what I'm about to share stays between us until we decide how to proceed." Dr. Chen, a composed oceanographer in her 50s, nodded solemnly. "Of course." Dr. Reeves hesitated, his weathered face creasing with concern. "This is about Thompson, isn't it?" "It's about much more than that," Sophia replied, carefully extracting the notebook from her pocket. She placed it on the lab table between them and opened it to the damning page with the 6-year-old coordinates and the notation about survivors. As the 2 scientists read the entry, their expressions transformed from curiosity to shock to outrage. "This can't be real," Dr. Chen whispered, adjusting her glasses as if the words might change under closer scrutiny. I'm afraid it is, Sophia said grimly. The captain knew there were survivors on that island, likely Matthew's grandparents, and he deliberately abandoned them. Dr. Reeves slammed his palm against the table. This is criminal negligence at the very least. Maritime law requires captains to render assistance to anyone in distress at sea. From the bridge, Captain Rivera observed the island growing larger on the horizon, with visible tension in his shoulders. Despite his reluctance to return, the unified demand from the crew had left him no choice. His fingers drummed nervously on the navigation console as he issued a series of short, clipped orders to maintain their approach vector, despite the challenging currents surrounding the uncharted landmass. "Steady as she goes," Rivera commanded, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "Keep us at least half a mile offshore. We'll send a rescue boat once we're in position." The first officer studied the captain with barely concealed suspicion. "Sir, shouldn't we get closer? A half mile is an unnecessarily cautious distance for a rescue operation." "The waters around the island are treacherous," Rivera snapped too quickly. "We can't risk the ship. That's my final decision." On the island, Matthew had returned to his grandparents' cabin after spotting the approaching ship. With methodical care, he began categorizing and documenting everything he'd discovered. Each item told a story of their ingenuity and resilience. Handmade fishing hooks, garden tools fashioned from debris, cooking implements created from salvaged metal and stone. He carefully annotated each photograph he took with his now recharged phone, creating a detailed record of their survival. "I won't let your story be forgotten," he promised aloud, as if his grandparents might hear him. "Everyone will know what you accomplished here." Matthew carefully selected the most significant artifacts to take with him. The diary, of course, the letters written to him, his grandmother's sketchbook, his grandfather's pocket watch, and a few of the most impressive handmade tools. Everything else he organized neatly within the cabin, treating it as the historical site it deserved to be. When he finished, Matthew stepped outside and raised a weathered flag he'd found among his grandparents' belongings, a piece of yellow fabric with a crudely painted SOS. He attached it to a tall bamboo pole and secured it in front of the cabin, making sure it would be visible to anyone approaching from the beach. Back on the ship, Sophia had expanded her circle of confidants, carefully sharing the captain's notebook with key crew members. The ship's engineer, communications officer, and medical doctor now sat in the small conference room, faces grave as they discussed the implications. "The coordinates match perfectly with this island," the engineer confirmed, comparing the notebook entries with their current position. "And the date aligns exactly with when the cruise ship disappeared." "But why?" the medical doctor asked, baffled. "Why would he see survivors and not report it? Not attempt rescue?" Sophia pointed to another entry in the notebook, dated the same day. "Cargo inspection. Situation compromised. Must divert to alternate port immediately." He was carrying something illegal, the communications officer realized. Contraband or smuggled goods of some kind. Reporting survivors would have meant explaining why his vessel was in these waters to begin with. "So he let them die to protect himself," the engineer said, disgust evident in his voice. "We need to confront him," Dr. Reeves stated firmly, "as a united group." While Sophia and her allies planned their confrontation, Captain Rivera grew increasingly agitated on the bridge. He ordered the ship to maintain position farther from shore than protocol would dictate for a rescue mission, claiming concern about submerged reefs. When the first rescue boat was finally being prepared, he insisted on a minimal crew. "Just 2 people," he ordered. "We don't know what hazards might be present on the island." "Captain," the first officer objected, "standard rescue protocol calls for at least 4 personnel, including medical staff." "I'm well aware of protocol," Rivera snapped, "but this isn't a standard situation. 2 people only." As the small rescue boat was being lowered, Sophia and her group of 7 allies arrived on the bridge. Their collective presence created an immediate tension, with Captain Rivera visibly stiffening as they filed in, positioning themselves between him and the exit. "What is the meaning of this?" Rivera demanded, though his voice lacked its usual authority. Dr. Reeves stepped forward, holding up the notebook. "We know, Captain. We know you saw survivors on this island 6 years ago and chose to abandon them." The color drained from Rivera's face. His eyes darted to the notebook, then to the assembled group, calculating his options. "That's absurd. Where did you get that? It's private property." "Is it true?" Sophia pressed, stepping closer. "Did you see Matthew's grandparents alive on this island and leave them to die?" The bridge fell silent, every crew member present turning to watch the confrontation unfold. Rivera's composure cracked under the collective scrutiny. "You don't understand," he finally said, his voice dropping. "It was complicated." "Explain it then," the ship's doctor demanded. Rivera sank into the captain's chair, suddenly looking years older. "I was transporting specialized research equipment, unofficial cargo for private interests. If I'd reported survivors, there would have been an investigation. Questions about my route, my cargo." "So you left them to die," Sophia stated flatly. "Human beings who needed rescue." "I marked the coordinates," Rivera protested weakly. "I intended to send an anonymous tip once I had delivered the cargo, but there were complications, delays, and then too much time had passed." "You're relieved of command," the first officer stated firmly, no longer willing to stand by. "As per maritime law, I'm assuming control of this vessel due to your demonstrated unfitness and potential criminal conduct." Rivera made no move to resist as two crew members positioned themselves on either side of him. The weight of his 6-year secret seemed to have finally crushed whatever strength he had left. On the island, Matthew was unaware of the drama unfolding on the ship. He had spent the past hour exploring the last location mentioned in his grandmother's diary, a cave near the island's center where she had written her final entries. The walls were covered with her writings, observations about the island's beauty, memories of her life with Harold, and messages to Matthew that she never expected him to read. "I hope you have found adventure, Matthew," one passage read. "But more importantly, I hope you have found that love is the greatest adventure of all." Reading her final thoughts, written when she knew she was dying, Matthew felt a profound sense of closure and connection. His grandparents had lived their last days with dignity, courage, and love, far from the boring existence he had once mocked. When he emerged from the cave, Matthew noticed the rescue boat finally approaching the shore. He made his way down to the beach, carrying his precious cargo of family artifacts. As the boat drew closer, he recognized Sophia standing in the bow, her hand shielding her eyes against the sun as she scanned the shoreline. "Matthew!" she called when she spotted him, her voice carrying across the water. He raised his arm in greeting, surprised by the complex emotions churning within him: relief at being rescued, gratitude for Sophia's persistence, but also a strange reluctance to leave this place that had brought him closer to his grandparents than he had ever been in life. When the boat reached the shallows, Sophia jumped out and waded through the surf toward him. The concern etched on her face transformed to relief as she drew closer. "Are you all right?" she asked, scanning him for injuries. "I'm better than all right," Matthew replied, clutching the waterproof case containing the diary. "I found them, Sophia. I found their story." "And we found the truth about the captain," Sophia responded, her expression darkening. "He knew Matt. He saw survivors on this island 6 years ago and abandoned them because he was smuggling contraband on his ship." From this vantage point, as Matthew took in the distant figure of the Esperanza on the horizon, he could see figures moving on the bridge, a confrontation taking place. After Sophia discovered the disturbing evidence in the captain's notebook, the entire crew had organized a proper mutiny to ensure Matthew would be rescued and justice would finally be served. Matthew stared at Sophia, his mind struggling to process her words. The captain had seen survivors, his grandparents, and deliberately left them to die. The revelation hit him like a physical blow, his knees nearly buckling beneath the weight of it. He saw them? Matthew's voice cracked. And just sailed away? Sophia nodded grimly, placing a steadying hand on his arm. The notebook contains explicit coordinates and notes about seeing survivors on the beach. He was smuggling illegal cargo and didn't want to risk exposure or investigation. They could have been rescued, Matthew whispered, his gaze drifting toward the horizon where the Esperanza floated. They could have lived. All this time I thought it was an accident, a tragedy no one could prevent. The rescue boat crew waited respectfully at the shoreline, giving them space. One of them eventually approached, clearing his throat. Dr. Chen, we should head back soon. Weather reports indicate another system moving in by evening. Matthew turned to look at the island that had been his grandparents' final home. The thought of leaving suddenly filled him with unexpected reluctance. This place, which had once represented only abandonment and tragedy in his mind, now felt sacred, a testament to his grandparents' remarkable resilience and love. I need a little more time, he said, his voice stronger now. There's something I need to show you before we leave. Sophia glanced at the darkening sky, then back at the waiting boat. We have about an hour before we need to depart. The ship can't risk staying in these waters if another storm hits. Matthew nodded gratefully. That's enough. Follow me. He led Sophia along the shore and up the narrow path toward his grandparents' cabin. As they walked, he explained everything he had discovered: the diary, the letters, the remarkable home they had built. Sophia listened in amazed silence, occasionally squeezing his arm in wordless support. When the small structure came into view, with its carefully thatched roof and Lardos Thompson inscription, Sophia stopped in her tracks. They built this, just the two of them? With whatever materials they could salvage or create, Matthew confirmed, a note of pride in his voice. Grandpa was always good with his hands, but this, he gestured at the sturdy little home, this is something else entirely. Inside the cabin, Matthew showed Sophia the ingenious adaptations his grandparents had made: the rainwater collection system, the tools crafted from salvaged materials, the careful organization of their limited resources. He shared passages from the diary and showed her the letters addressed to him. They forgave me, he said softly, holding one of the letters. After what I said to them, they still loved me. They wrote these knowing I'd probably never read them. Sophia wiped away a tear as she examined the sketch of Matthew that his grandmother had drawn from memory. They never stopped being grandparents, even here. I've been thinking, Matthew said, carefully rewrapping the precious items he'd collected. This place, it's not just where they died. It's where they lived, really lived. Maybe for the first time. I don't want to just take these things and leave. This island is part of their story. What are you suggesting? Sophia asked. Before Matthew could respond, a call came through on the radio the rescue team had brought. Dr. Chen, we need to return immediately. The storm system has accelerated. Captain's orders. Acting captain's orders. Matthew felt the conflicting emotions twist inside him. Logic dictated they leave now, before another storm trapped them. But the thought of abandoning this place, possibly forever, felt like losing his grandparents all over again. I don't want to leave, he admitted, his voice barely audible. Sophia placed her hand over his. I understand. But we have to go, Matt. We can come back, I promise you. We'll make that happen. With painful reluctance, Matthew gathered the most precious items: the diary, letters, sketchbook, and his grandfather's pocket watch. Everything else he carefully arranged within the cabin as a kind of memorial. Before, Closing the door for the final time, he placed his grandmother's pearl necklace gently on the table, a symbolic gesture of leaving part of himself behind. The walk back to the beach was silent, each lost in their thoughts. When they reached the rescue boat, dark clouds were already gathering on the horizon, the wind picking up strength with each passing minute. As they pushed off from shore, Matthew kept his eyes fixed on the island, memorizing every detail, making silent promises to return. The journey back to the Esperanza was choppy, the sea beginning to swell with the approaching storm. By the time they reached the ship, rain had started to fall, and the crew was hurrying to secure loose equipment. Climbing aboard, Matthew was immediately struck by the changed atmosphere. Crew members nodded respectfully as he passed, some offering quiet words of condolence or support. Word of his discovery and the captain's betrayal had clearly spread throughout the ship. The acting captain, formerly the first officer, greeted them on deck. "Dr. Thompson, Dr. Chen, we're preparing to depart immediately. The storm will hit in approximately 1 hour. Where's Rivera?" Matthew asked, unable to keep the edge from his voice. "Confined to his quarters under guard. Once we reach port, he'll be turned over to the maritime authorities." The acting captain hesitated. "I want you to know that none of us had any idea. If we had known—" Matthew nodded, accepting the unfinished sentiment. As they moved toward the bridge, he glanced back one last time at the island, now shrinking in the distance as the ship began to move. The rain intensified, partially obscuring his view, as if the island itself was fading into memory. Inside, Matthew was shown to a cabin where he could rest and secure his grandparents' belongings. Sophia helped him arrange the items carefully, treating each one as the treasure it was. "I can't stop thinking about what they went through," Matthew said, gently placing the diary on the small desk. "All those years believing no one was coming for them. And someone did come. Someone saw them and just left. I can't imagine that kind of betrayal," Sophia agreed, her voice tight with anger. "What Rivera did wasn't just negligence. It was inhuman." A knock at the door interrupted them. The ship's doctor stood in the doorway, looking uncomfortable. "Dr. Thompson, the captain, Rivera, is asking to speak with you. He's quite insistent." "No," Sophia interjected firmly. "Absolutely not." Matthew sat silent for a moment, considering. Part of him wanted to refuse, to never look at the man who had abandoned his grandparents. But another part, the part that had spent 6 years seeking answers, needed to hear whatever Rivera had to say. "I'll see him," Matthew decided. Despite Sophia's protests, Matthew made his way to the captain's quarters, where 2 crew members stood guard outside. They nodded grimly as he approached, one of them opening the door to reveal Rivera sitting on the edge of his bunk, head bowed. The former captain looked up as Matthew entered, his face haggard and aged beyond his years. The confident, authoritative man who had commanded the ship was gone, replaced by someone who seemed hollowed out by guilt. "Why did you want to see me?" Matthew asked, his voice cold. Rivera gestured weakly to a chair, but Matthew remained standing, unwilling to show even that small courtesy. "I thought I should explain," Rivera began, his voice hoarse. "Not to excuse what I did, there is no excuse, but so you understand." "Understand what? That you left 2 innocent people to die because you were smuggling contraband?" Matthew's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "It was experimental research equipment," Rivera said quietly. "Unlicensed, unregistered, worth millions to certain private interests. I told myself it was just bending the rules, not really hurting anyone. Except you did hurt someone. You hurt my grandparents. You sentenced them to death." Rivera nodded slowly, accepting the accusation. "I saw the cruise ship go down during the storm. My vessel was about 20 miles away. By the time we reached the area, there was nothing but floating debris. We were scanning for survivors when one of my crew spotted movement on that island through binoculars." Matthew's throat tightened as he imagined his grandparents on the beach, perhaps waving desperately at the passing ship, hope rising then falling as it continued without stopping. I told myself I would report it anonymously once we reached port, Rivera continued. But the delivery went wrong. There were complications, investigations into the equipment. By the time things quieted down, weeks had passed, then months. His voice cracked. The longer I waited, the harder it became to come forward. So you just forgot about them? Matthew's voice was barely a whisper. No, Rivera said, looking up with reddened eyes. I never forgot. I've collected every report of missing persons at sea since then. Hundreds of them. He gestured to a box on his desk, filled with newspaper clippings and printed reports. I think I was hoping to, I don't know, make amends somehow, but there's no making up for what I did. Matthew stared at the box, understanding dawning. This was Rivera's penance, his pathetic attempt at atonement for an unforgivable sin. Not just negligence or cowardice, but a deliberate choice that cost 2 lives. You could have gone back, Matthew said finally, even months later. They were alive for years on that island. You could have saved them. Rivera nodded, a tear tracking down his weathered cheek. I know. That's something I'll live with for the rest of my life. He looked up at Matthew, his eyes pleading. What was in the diary? Did they suffer? Matthew considered the question, thinking about everything he had read in his grandmother's careful handwriting. The hardships, yes, the hunger, the loneliness, the fear, but also the love, the resilience, the unexpected moments of joy they had found together. They lived, Matthew said simply. Despite what you did, they lived. And in some ways, they lived more fully on that island than they ever had before. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. That's something you'll never understand. As Matthew walked away from the captain's quarters, he felt a strange sense of closure settling over him. The anger was still there, burning beneath the surface, but alongside it was something unexpected. A kind of peace born from finally knowing the truth, no matter how painful. In the captain's cabin, now under heavy guard, Rivera opened a hidden drawer and removed a final piece of evidence he hadn't shared. A photograph taken from his ship 6 years ago, showing 2 distant figures standing on the beach of the uncharted island, arms raised in a desperate plea for rescue that never came. The photograph slipped from Rivera's trembling fingers as the ship's bow cut through increasingly rough waters, heading back toward civilization and the consequences that awaited him. Matthew stood at the railing on the starboard side, watching the island, his grandparents' final home, disappear into the misty horizon. The looming storm clouds provided a fittingly somber backdrop as the Esperanza carried him away from the place that had given him answers but opened so many new wounds. 3 days later, the research vessel docked at the port of San Diego. The California sunshine seemed inappropriately cheerful as Matthew stepped onto solid ground for the first time in weeks, clutching his backpack, containing his grandparents' precious belongings. A small crowd had gathered on the pier, university officials, maritime authorities, and, to Matthew's surprise, members of his family. His parents and his aunt, his father's sister, stood anxiously at the front of the group, their faces a mixture of relief and apprehension. "Matthew!" His mother rushed forward, embracing him tightly. "We've been so worried. The university called us when they lost contact with the ship during the storm, and then when they told us you were missing on an uncharted island." Her voice broke, unable to complete the thought. Matthew returned her embrace, suddenly aware of how emotionally and physically exhausted he truly was. "I'm okay, Mom. But I found them. I found Grandma and Grandpa." His father and aunt stepped forward, confusion evident on their faces. "What do you mean you found them?" his father asked, his voice tentative, as if afraid of the answer. "Not them exactly," Matthew clarified, his throat tightening. But where they lived, where they died, and their story. He patted his backpack gently. They wrote it all down. Behind them, maritime authorities were escorting Captain Rivera off the ship in handcuffs. The man's head was bowed, his once proud posture now crumpled under the weight of his exposed crime. Matthew's family followed his gaze, questions forming on their lips. "It's a long story," Matthew said quietly. "I'll explain everything, but not here." The university had arranged temporary accommodations for the research team while the authorities investigated the incident. In a hotel suite overlooking the harbor, Matthew finally shared the full story with his family, carefully unpacking the diary, letters, and artifacts he had brought back from the island. "They survived the shipwreck," he explained, gently placing his grandmother's diary on the coffee table. "They made it to the island and lived there for years. Grandpa for 2 years, Grandma for almost 4. His aunt picked up the diary with trembling hands. "Elaine wrote this? All of this?" Matthew nodded. "Every day, almost. She documented everything, how they survived, what they built, what they thought about." He hesitated before adding, "And she wrote about me, about what I said to them before they left." The painful admission hung in the air. His family knew about the argument. Matthew had confessed it during the initial search for the missing cruise ship 6 years ago. It had been a source of immense guilt that had colored all their relationships since. "She forgave you," his mother said softly, reading a page from the diary. "Look, she writes here that she understood your frustration, that youth always sees age as wasted opportunity." Matthew nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "They both did. They wrote me letters they never thought I'd read." He pulled out the weathered pages, passing them carefully to his father. "They didn't just survive on that island, Dad. They lived. Really lived. They built a home, grew food, created tools. Grandpa even started building a raft." His father's eyes filled with tears as he read his parents' words. "This sounds like them. Even stranded on an island, Mom would be organizing and Dad would be building something." The following days brought a whirlwind of official interviews and depositions. Maritime authorities questioned Matthew extensively about Rivera's actions and the evidence found in the captain's notebook. University officials, initially concerned about the unauthorized deviation from the research mission, quickly changed their tune when the media caught wind of the story. Suddenly, the university was proudly supporting our researchers' incredible discovery and promising to fund a proper expedition to document the island. A week after their return, Matthew sat in a stark conference room at the Maritime Authority's regional headquarters, concluding his formal statement about the events. "And you're certain the island shows no signs of current habitation?" the official asked, finishing his notes. "Just what my grandparents left behind," Matthew confirmed. "Their shelter, their garden, now overgrown, and their personal effects. The prosecution will need those items as evidence against Captain Rivera," the official said, almost apologetically. "Some of them, perhaps," Matthew replied, firmly. "But their diary, their letters, those belong to my family. They're not evidence, they're our history." After much negotiation, an agreement was reached. The authorities would document and photograph all items for their case, but return the personal writings and smaller artifacts to the Thompson family. The more substantial evidence, including Rivera's notebook and the photographs he had taken of the island 6 years earlier, would remain in custody. 2 weeks after returning to the mainland, Matthew organized a private memorial service on a quiet stretch of beach north of San Diego. Only family and close friends attended, including Sophia, who had become an unexpected source of strength during the difficult days of interviews and media attention. The small gathering stood in a semicircle as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Matthew had arranged a simple display on a driftwood table: his grandfather's blue Hawaiian shirt, fragments of his grandmother's yellow dress, and at the center, the pearl necklace Matthew had given her, now carefully restored by a jeweler. We're here today to finally say goodbye, Matthew began, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. And more importantly, to celebrate the remarkable lives of Harold and Elaine Thompson. 6 years ago, we held a memorial service without bodies, without answers, without closure. Today we gather with knowledge of their final chapter, a chapter that was difficult, but also filled with incredible courage, resourcefulness, and love. He shared selected passages from the diary, painting a picture of their survival and daily life on the island. There were tears, but also smiles, even occasional laughter as the family recognized the distinctive personalities of Harold and Elaine shining through even in extreme circumstances. My grandfather once told me that a good life isn't measured by dramatic moments or grand adventures, Matthew said, nearing the end of his remarks. It's measured by the love you give and receive along the way. On that island, they proved that truth in the most profound way possible. They didn't just endure, they lived with purpose and love until the very end. As the sun touched the horizon, Matthew carefully folded the Hawaiian shirt around the pearl necklace and placed them in a small wooden box crafted from driftwood he had brought from the island. Together with his father and aunt, he walked to the water's edge and knelt in the wet sand. "Grandpa, Grandma," he said softly, "you found your way home to us, and now we return these tokens to the sea that both took you and, in a strange way, gave you your greatest adventure." He placed the box in a small hollow he had dug, letting the incoming tide gradually reach it, eventually lifting the box and carrying it gently into the waiting ocean. As the family dispersed, Matthew remained at the shore with Sophia, watching the last colors of sunset paint the water. "What will you do now?" she asked quietly. "I've been thinking about that," Matthew replied, reaching for her hand. "The university wants a full report and publication about the island. They're already talking about a research expedition with proper documentation of the site." "That's good," Sophia nodded. "Your grandparents' story deserves to be told." "It's more than that," Matthew continued. "This whole experience has shown me there are probably other stories out there, other missing persons whose fates remain unknown because no one kept looking, or because someone like Rivera chose silence over rescue." In the weeks that followed, Matthew channeled his grief and purpose into establishing the Thompson Foundation for Maritime Search and Recovery. Using the media attention his story had garnered, he secured initial funding from private donors and a matching grant from the university. The foundation would focus on two primary missions: researching remote islands that might harbor shipwreck survivors and developing new technologies to locate persons lost at sea. Matthew's first official act, as the Foundation's director, was to convene a panel of experts in oceanography, search and rescue, and maritime law to develop better protocols for documenting and investigating disappearances at sea. Sophia, now the Foundation's research director, worked alongside him, her scientific expertise complementing his passionate advocacy. 3 months after their return, Matthew stood before a gathering of maritime officials, academic peers, and potential donors in the university's Grand Hall. Behind him, a large photograph of Harold and Elaine Thompson smiled down at the audience, flanked by images of their island home and artifacts they had created. "My grandparents' story is unusual only because we found the truth," Matthew told the assembled crowd. "There are countless others who have vanished at sea whose stories remain untold. The Thompson Foundation aims to change that, to bring closure to families and to ensure that no one who might be found is ever abandoned again." After the presentation, as attendees mingled and discussed the Foundation's ambitious goals, an attorney approached Matthew with an unexpected proposal. "Dr. Thompson, my client wishes to make a substantial donation to your foundation, anonymously, of course." "Who is your client?" Matthew asked, curious. The attorney hesitated. "I'm not at liberty to say, but the funds come with no strings attached. The donation is motivated by, let's call it a desire to make amends for past maritime negligence." Matthew immediately understood. Rivera, awaiting trial and facing years in prison, was attempting to direct whatever financial resources he had toward the foundation. It was a complex moral question that Matthew wasn't prepared to answer on the spot. "Tell your client I'll consider it," he said finally. "But true amends can't be made with money alone. Real atonement requires acknowledging all the truth still hidden beneath the surface." After the attorney left, Matthew took a moment alone in the empty auditorium, looking up at his grandparents' photograph. "We're just getting started," he promised them quietly. "Your story is going to help others find their way home." 5 years after the discovery of the uncharted island, Professor Matthew Thompson stood at the lectern in his oceanography classroom, his passion for the subject evident in the animated way he gestured toward the projected map of Pacific currents. The students watched with rapt attention as he traced the path of the North Pacific Gyre with his laser pointer, explaining how these massive oceanic conveyor belts could carry debris or lifeboats thousands of miles from their point of origin. "And that's why," he concluded, adjusting the brightly colored Hawaiian shirt he wore, "traditional search patterns often fail in cases of maritime disappearances. The ocean doesn't move in straight lines, and neither should our search methodologies." As the students gathered their belongings after class, a young woman approached his desk. "Professor Thompson, I read your paper on adaptive search algorithms for maritime rescue. Is it true you developed those based on your grandparents' experience?" Matthew smiled, touching the pocket watch chain visible against his shirt. "Everything I teach has been shaped by their story, Miss Chen. The Thompson Foundation's work is built on the premise that conventional wisdom sometimes needs to be challenged." His office in the university's Marine Sciences building reflected both his academic pursuits and his personal journey. Maps dominated one wall, many marked with colored pins indicating locations of interest to the Foundation's ongoing search efforts. On another wall hung framed photographs, his grandparents before their final cruise, the small cabin they had built on the island, and a recent image of the memorial lighthouse the Foundation had constructed on the island 2 years earlier. Matthew was arranging papers on his desk when Sophia knocked on his open door, entering with a stack of files. Marriage had softened the professional formality between them, but her role as the Foundation's research director still kept their work relationship productively challenging. "The board approved the funding for the new sonar array," she announced, setting the files on his desk. "And the university press wants to know if you'll be finished with the manuscript by June." "Just final revisions left," Matthew confirmed, gesturing to his laptop where the nearly completed book, Beyond the Horizon, New Approaches to Maritime Search and Recovery, waited for its concluding chapter. "Did the satellite imagery from the Mariana region arrive?" "This morning. The analysis team is already processing it." Sophia moved to stand beside him, resting her hand lightly on his shoulder. "You should come home at a reasonable hour tonight. Your mother called. She's bringing Harold for dinner, remember?" Matthew smiled at the mention of their 3-year-old son, named Harold Elaine Thompson, in honor of his grandparents. "I wouldn't miss it. Just need to finish the lecture notes for tomorrow and review those Indonesian case files." After Sophia left, Matthew turned to the large window overlooking the harbor. From his office, he could see the sleek research vessel docked at the university's marine terminal, the Second Chance, commissioned 2 years earlier to replace the aging Esperanza. The ship represented everything the Thompson Foundation stood for: cutting-edge technology dedicated to finding those lost at sea and mapping uncharted islands that might harbor survivors or remains. The Foundation's work had already yielded remarkable results. 3 previously undocumented islands had been formally mapped and added to nautical charts. 7 cases of missing vessels had been resolved, providing closure to families who had lived with uncertainty for years. Most significantly, a family of 4 had been rescued from an atoll in the South Pacific after their sailboat was destroyed in a storm. They had survived for 11 months before the Second Chance discovered them during a systematic survey. Matthew's attention returned to his desk, where a newspaper clipping lay beside his keyboard. The headline read, "Ex-Captain Rivera released after serving 4-year sentence." The man who had abandoned Matthew's grandparents had served his time for criminal negligence and violation of maritime law. According to the article, Rivera had immediately boarded a plane to his native Spain, leaving behind the country where his name had become synonymous with callous disregard for human life. What the article didn't mention was the letter Matthew had received 3 days earlier, a handwritten note from Rivera explaining that he would spend his remaining years working with a Spanish maritime rescue organization, volunteering on ships that patrolled the Mediterranean for refugee vessels in distress. "I cannot undo my sin," Rivera had written, "but perhaps I can prevent others from committing the same one." Matthew had not yet decided whether to respond. Some wounds, he had learned, never fully healed. They simply became part of who you are. A knock on his doorframe interrupted his thoughts. One of his graduate students stood there, excitement evident on his face. "Professor Thompson, the imaging team found something in the Sulu Sea data, a metallic signature consistent with a vessel approximately 120 feet in length. It matches the profile of the fishing trawler that disappeared in that region last year. Get the coordinates to the Second Chance's captain," Matthew instructed, immediately standing. "Tell them to prepare for departure within 48 hours, and contact the families. No promises, but let them know we're investigating." That evening, Matthew left his office earlier than usual, driving home to the modest beachfront cottage he and Sophia had purchased shortly after their marriage. The house's wide windows and ocean-facing deck reminded him, in the best possible way, of his grandparents' island cabin. Simple, functional, and deeply connected to the sea. He arrived home to find his mother already there, chasing a giggling Harold around the living room. The boy's dark curls bounced as he ran, clutching a toy boat above his head. "Daddy!" Harold squealed, changing direction to launch himself at Matthew's legs. "Grandma brought boat." Matthew scooped up his son, tossing him gently into the air. "Is that so? And what adventures is this boat going on?" "Finding people," Harold declared seriously. "Like you do." Later, after dinner, and after Harold had been tucked into bed with stories of brave ships and discovered islands, Matthew and Sophia sat on their deck, watching the moonlight play across the waves. The rhythmic sound of the surf provided a soothing backdrop to their conversation about the Foundation's next expedition. "The board is concerned about expanding into the South China Sea," Sophia mentioned, sipping her tea. "The political complications could be significant." "People don't stop needing rescue because of political boundaries," Matthew replied, his eyes on the horizon. "My grandparents didn't care about maritime jurisdiction when they were stranded. They just wanted to be found." Sophia nodded, understanding his perspective but still practical. "We'll need to secure additional diplomatic clearances. I'll speak with our contacts at the State Department." The following morning, Matthew brought Harold to his office for what had become a weekend tradition. While Sophia attended a research conference, father and son would spend Saturday morning at the university, Harold helping with important Foundation business before they visited the harbor to see the Second Chance. Matthew lifted his son to the window, pointing toward the sleek vessel being loaded with supplies for its upcoming mission. "See that ship, Harold? That's the Second Chance. Soon it's going to sail very far away to help find some lost fishermen." "Will they be on an island?" the boy asked, pressing his small hands against the glass. "Maybe," Matthew answered honestly. "Or maybe they're still on their boat, drifting. Either way, we're going to try our very best to find them." Harold nodded with the serious expression of a child absorbing an important lesson. "And bring them home to their families." "That's right," Matthew confirmed, his chest tightening with emotion at his son's understanding. "That's exactly what we do." After their visit to the ship, where Harold charmed the crew with his enthusiastic questions about everything from the sonar equipment to the galley operations, they stopped by the university's Maritime Museum. A special exhibition had been installed the previous year, dedicated to survival stories from around the world. At its center was the display Matthew had helped design, a carefully restored and preserved collection of items from his grandparents' island home. The diary, now professionally conserved, lay open in a climate-controlled case, turned to a page where Elaine Thompson had written, "Today Harold showed me a stunning sunset. He says even paradise needs to be shared with someone you love." Beside it stood a model of the cabin they had built, created based on Matthew's photographs and descriptions. A placard introduced the exhibition, "Never Too Late: The True Adventure of Harold and Elaine Thompson." Visitors often lingered longest at this display, moved by the story of ordinary people showing extraordinary resilience. "That's my name," Harold pointed out, as he always did when they visited. "That's right," Matthew agreed, lifting his son to better see the photographs. "You were named after two very brave, very kind people who never stopped hoping, even when things seemed impossible." As they stood there, a museum docent approached with a tour group. "This is one of our most popular exhibits," she was explaining. "Dr. Thompson, whose foundation funded this wing of the museum, discovered the fate of his grandparents on an uncharted island after they had been missing for 6 years." Matthew nodded politely to the group but stepped back, allowing the docent to tell the story. He had learned that his grandparents' experience belonged not just to his family, but to all who might draw inspiration from it. Their story had become larger than his personal grief or guilt. It had transformed into a beacon of hope for others facing the unknown. That night, after Harold was asleep, Matthew sat at his home office desk, adding the final paragraphs to his book manuscript. The conclusion had eluded him for weeks, but watching his son today, seeing Harold's innocent understanding of the Foundation's purpose, had finally provided the words he needed. "The ocean takes, but it also preserves," he wrote. "Stories, artifacts, and sometimes even lives wait to be discovered in its vastness. The greatest disservice we can do to those lost at sea is to stop searching, to surrender to the immensity of the task. Every island mapped, every mystery solved, every survivor found represents a promise kept, not just to those who wait for rescue, but to those who taught us, through their courage and perseverance, that abandonment is never the end of the story." Years later, the young Harold, now a teenager, would find his father asleep in that same office, surrounded by old maps with a detailed plan open on his desk, an expedition to return to the unmapped island and build a small permanent lighthouse in memory of Harold and Elaine Thompson, a beacon that would guide other lost souls in the vast ocean home.